Imagine waking up every morning not knowing if the sound you hear next will be silence or a siren. Imagine putting your kids to bed and then spending the next hour wondering whether you will be sprinting to a bomb shelter before sunrise. Imagine going to work, sitting down at your desk, and suddenly every phone in the building goes off at the exact same time. Not a notification, not a news alert, but a warning. A warning that means you have minutes, sometimes seconds, to get underground or find cover. That is not a hypothetical. That is the daily reality for millions of people living in Israel right now. Since February 28, 2026, the country has not had a single day of peace. Not one quiet Tuesday, not one calm Friday evening, not one morning where people woke up and simply went about their lives without the shadow of what is coming next hanging over everything. Every single day for over 2 weeks, Iran has been launching ballistic missiles at Israeli cities. And when the missiles stop, the danger does not stop with them. Because what Iran is actually firing is not just missiles. It is something far more sinister, far more indiscriminate, and far more illegal under international law. Most people watching this conflict from the outside think they understand what is happening. A military exchange between two regional powers, rockets going back and forth, interceptor systems shooting them down, numbers on a screen, statistics in a news ticker. But what is actually unfolding on the ground, in real neighborhoods, in real cities, among real families, is something the world has not yet fully reckoned with. The human cost is staggering. The weapon strategy Iran has deployed is one of the most documented violations of international humanitarian law seen in any modern conflict. And the long game Iran is playing is more calculated, more patient, and more dangerous than most outside observers have grasped. Every word of what follows is documented, verified, and happening right now. Stay with this. To understand why the sky above Tel Aviv is lit up with falling bomblets at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, you have to go back to the night of February 28, 2026, because that is the night that set everything in motion and the night that changed the strategic map of the Middle East in the span of a few hours. The United States and Israel launched a joint surprise military operation against Iran that was unlike anything the region had seen in decades. In the opening hours of the operation, the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, was killed. Not wounded, not forced underground, killed. Alongside him, senior military commanders, nuclear scientists, and top government officials were assassinated in a coordinated wave of strikes designed to hit the Iranian state at every level of its leadership simultaneously. While American bombers and cruise missiles struck thousands of military and nuclear targets across the country, the Israeli Air Force launched what would become the largest combat sortie in its entire history. 200 fighter jets in a single night, striking 500 separate military targets across Iran before dawn. The scale of that operation is almost impossible to absorb. 500 targets, 200 jets, one night. Years of planning, executed in hours. By any military calculation, it was a devastating and unprecedented blow. And by any rational assessment, Iran should have needed time, days, weeks, to assess the damage, reorganize its shattered command structure, grieve its dead leadership, and formulate a coherent response. History suggested it would pause. It did not pause. Within hours of the opening strikes, not days, hours, Iran launched what it named Operation True Promise 4, deliberately echoing 3 previous rounds of retaliation stretching back through 2024 and 2025. In each of those previous rounds, Iran had fired a calculated volley and then paused. It had launched its symbolic missiles and then watched the diplomatic room, measuring the world's reaction, reading the temperature of its regional neighbors, deciding whether to escalate or quietly step back. The pause was always part of the strategy. It gave Iran deniability. It gave it room to maneuver. This time there was no pause. No symbolic volley followed by a diplomatic exhale. Iran began an uninterrupted, continuous, around-the-clock campaign of ballistic, missile and drone attacks against Israel that has now stretched across 16 consecutive days, with no ceasefire offered, no negotiations proposed, and no sign of stopping. The first 24 hours of this war established something that every day since has only confirmed. The civilian population of Israel was going to bear the weight of this conflict in ways that could not be sanitized into military briefings and interceptor success rates. In the opening salvo alone, Iranian forces launched approximately 90 missiles at Israel. 90. before the first full day had passed. Within those first 24 hours, a ballistic missile scored a direct hit in the heart of Tel Aviv, killing a civilian woman and injuring 22 others, one of them seriously. Emergency services reported 89 people injured on that first day. Alone, 3 hit directly by missile fragments, and the rest hurt in the chaos of running, crushed in panicking crowds, struck by debris falling from intercepted missiles that had been blown apart high above the city and were now raining down in pieces. Ben Gurion International Airport, Israel's main gateway to the world, was forced to close. Israeli airspace was shut down entirely. Flights ceased. The country was severed from its normal commercial and travel connections in a strikingly physical way. Thousands of travelers were stranded mid-journey. The image of one of the busiest airports in the region sitting empty, its runways cleared, its departure boards frozen, told the story of just how fast a modern country can be pulled back from normalcy. The Israeli Ministry of Health took the extraordinary step of relocating its entire hospital operations underground, moving patients, medical equipment, doctors, and nursing staff into reinforced basement facilities across the country. The Home Front Command activated nationwide emergency protocols. 20,000 additional military reservists were called up on top of the 50,000 already on active duty. Within 48 hours of the first strike, the country had fully transformed into a wartime state unlike anything its citizens had lived through in decades. Then came March 1st. If February 28th was the shock, the first day of March was the grief. In the city of Beit Shemesh, 130,000 people living in the hills, between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, a city known for its large religious communities, its quiet residential streets, its synagogues and schools and family homes, an Iranian ballistic missile found its mark. It struck a synagogue. It struck the residential buildings surrounding it. 9 people were killed. 49 others were injured. 9 human beings who had gathered in a house of worship or who simply lived in the apartments nearby and were going about their Sunday morning, were killed by an Iranian missile in a neighborhood that had no military significance whatsoever. Their names were not announced to the world with the same urgency as the political developments surrounding the conflict. Their funerals were not broadcast on international television, but they were real people. A city that had never been considered a military target buried 9 of its residents in the first days of a war that was supposed to be between governments and armies. As of today, the Beit Shemesh synagogue strike remains the single deadliest Iranian attack on Israeli soil in this entire war. But that single strike, as devastating as it was, does not capture what Iran is actually doing. Because the story of this war is not only about individual tragedies, it is about a weapon, a specific weapon, and what Iran is doing with that weapon is the part that the world has been slowest to understand. Most people following this conflict from a distance have a mental picture of what a missile attack looks like. A missile launches. Radar systems detect it, interceptors go up, and either the threat is neutralized or it is not. One threat, one response, one outcome, clean, binary, comprehensible. Iran has shattered that picture, because Iran is not just firing ballistic missiles at Israel. It is firing cluster bomb missiles. And the difference between those two things is not a technical footnote. It is the difference between a targeted strike and a weapon designed specifically to scatter death across the largest possible area without distinction. Here is precisely how a cluster bomb missile functions. When it is launched from Iranian territory and tracked on radar as it flies toward Israel, it looks like a single incoming ballistic missile. One threat signature, one incoming object. But as it descends through the upper atmosphere toward its target, it does not function as a single weapon. It opens, mid-air, mid-flight, it splits apart and releases dozens of smaller submunitions, bomblets, which then scatter across an enormous area below. A single Iranian cluster missile can spread between 24 and 80 individual explosive devices across a radius of up to 8 kilometers. Let that settle for a moment. One missile, up to 80 separate explosive devices across a radius of 8 kilometers. That is not one blast in one location. That is dozens of explosions simultaneously, distributed across an area the size of a small city, raining down without any guidance or targeting, on roads and rooftops and parks and schools and parking garages and playgrounds and everything else that lies within that radius. And the ones that do not explode on impact do not disappear. They sit, waiting in silence on rooftops, in fields, on playground surfaces, in construction rubble, until someone steps on them, or touches them, or a gust of wind rolls them off a ledge. The IDF confirmed that Iran has been using cluster munitions against Israel almost every single day since the first day of this war. An IDF spokesman told the Wall Street Journal that these weapons have been deployed continuously and repeatedly throughout the conflict. By the 10th day of the war, Iran had fired a total of 300 missiles at Israel, and nearly half of those missiles were carrying cluster submunitions. Nearly half. In the first 10 days of this conflict, Iran deliberately chose to fire approximately 150 cluster bomb missiles at one of the most densely populated regions on the surface of the Earth. The Convention on Cluster Munitions is an international treaty signed by more than 100 nations. It bans these weapons entirely and describes them as inherently indiscriminate, incapable, by their very design of distinguishing between a soldier and a civilian, between a military depot and a school, between a weapons facility and an apartment building. Amnesty International had already condemned Iran's use of cluster munitions during the 12-day war of June 2025, calling it a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law and stating that the manner in which Iran deployed these weapons showed clear disregard for the most fundamental principles of armed conflict. Iran is not a signatory to the convention. Iran does not regard itself as bound by it. And in this war, Iran has used cluster munitions on a scale that makes its previous usage look restrained, not as a last resort, not as a rare escalation, as a deliberate, daily, systematic feature of its campaign against a country the size of New Jersey. And the human consequences of that choice are not theoretical. They are written in scenes that happened on specific nights, in specific neighborhoods that we can name and document and describe in full. It was 10:50 in the evening on March 9th. The phones of millions of Israelis across the central part of the country lit up simultaneously with a missile alert. Not the first of the night. The second launch in less than 30 minutes. People who had been living with this for 11 days already knew exactly what to do. They grabbed their children. They moved toward shelters. They counted down in their heads. 7 minutes passed. Then the sirens started screaming across the region. 4 minutes after the sirens, videos began appearing on social media, showing something that people in Tel Aviv had genuinely never seen in the sky above their own city before. Dozens of small, bright points of light, fast, glowing, silent, descending over the greater metropolitan area from high above. In the footage, they almost looked beautiful, almost looked like something you would stop to watch, like falling stars over the city. They were the Bomblets, dozens of them, spreading out in every direction from a single Iranian missile that had already been intercepted high in the atmosphere, but that had already released its submunitions before the intercept could stop them. The missile was destroyed. The cargo it had already scattered was not stopped. It was already falling. CNN confirmed 5 separate impact sites from that single attack, spread across more than 8 miles of urban landscape. At a construction site on the outskirts of Tel Aviv, 2 men were working late. Construction workers doing their job. They were not in a shelter. They could not get to one in time. Both were killed by Iranian cluster bomb, submunitions that fell directly on their work site. In a neighboring town, a person walking down the street was wounded by a bomblet that landed nearby. In the city of Rishon LeZion, a children's playground was struck, its equipment shredded, its ground torn open, the surface where kids had been playing. That afternoon reduced to a blast scene by nightfall. The previous day, March 8th, had seen another cluster missile scatter its submunitions across a 7-mile stretch of northern Tel Aviv and a neighboring suburb, striking a car wash, multiple residential areas, and a park. And March 8th itself was a day that Israel's emergency services will not forget quickly. Iran launched 6 separate volleys of ballistic missiles at Israel in a single Sunday. 6 distinct launches, one day. By the time the 6th and final salvo hit in the late afternoon, a man in his 40s had been seriously wounded in Tel Aviv. 5 more people were injured in Petah Tikva, including a 25-year-old in moderate condition. Police confirmed more than a dozen separate impact sites across central Israel from that one wave alone, the spread of the sites confirming cluster warheads. Emergency services worked through scene after scene, fire crews extinguishing, small blazes ignited by bomblets, landing on rooftops and in parkland. Bomb disposal teams methodically marking and securing undetonated submunitions lying in the street or wedged into garden walls. Paramedics treating blast injuries in neighborhoods that had been quiet and ordinary 30 minutes before. Search and rescue going door to door. the Home Front Command began issuing guidance that no government should have to issue to its own citizens. Do not approach undetonated bomblets. Stay in your shelter for several minutes after the main sirens stop, because the danger does not end when the missile is intercepted. The bomblets may still be falling. They may have already landed. They may be sitting 5 meters from your front door right now, waiting. The bomblets were always still falling. That was the point. Here is the part of this story that the casualty figures alone cannot tell. The cluster bomb campaign is not just a weapon choice. It is a strategic architecture. Understanding why Iran chose this weapon and what it is designed to accomplish beyond the immediate damage is essential to understanding what kind of war this actually is. Every time Iran fires a single cluster bomb missile at Israel, several things happen simultaneously. First, the phones of millions of people in Tel Aviv, in Bnei Brak, in Ramat Gan, in Petah Tikva, in Holon, in Rishon LeZion, all go off at the same moment. Schools stop. Business is close. Traffic freezes. Entire office floors empty as people move to stairwells and underground areas. The economic and social life of central Israel, home to the country's largest population centers, its technology sector, its financial infrastructure, halts completely for the duration of every single attack. And those attacks are happening 10 times a day. Second, Israel's layered air defense system must respond. The long-range Arrow interceptor attempts to destroy incoming ballistic missiles at high altitude, early in their flight path. If it succeeds before the missile opens and releases its submunitions, the threat is over. But if the missile has already deployed its bomblets before the Arrow can reach it, then destroying the missile does nothing to stop the dozens of tiny metal explosives already descending toward the city. At that point, the Iron Dome system must attempt to intercept individual submunitions, objects that are far smaller, far faster, and far more numerous than a single ballistic missile. The interception problem multiplies with each cluster warhead. And then there is the third dimension, the one that Israeli defense officials have described as the most strategically consequential of all. Israel has a finite supply of interceptor missiles. Every interception, successful or not, expends a costly, irreplaceable weapon from a stockpile that cannot be replenished overnight. Iran's cluster bomb strategy is explicitly designed to drain that supply as fast as possible. One cluster missile does not force Israel to expend one interceptor. It can force the expenditure of dozens, as Israeli systems attempt to track and engage individual bomblets scattered across kilometers of urban airspace. Simultaneously, an Israeli missile defense expert explained the fundamental equation to CNN in blunt terms: the ratio between Iran's available missiles and Israel's available interceptors represents a profound strategic challenge that only grows more acute with every day of sustained fire. This is a war of attrition being waged against the most finite and precious element of Israel's defensive architecture. Iran also moved to dismantle the infrastructure that makes defense possible. On March 5th, the IRGC announced the launch of its heavy Fatah-2 ballistic missiles, 1-ton explosive warheads, 13 meters long, 2,000-kilometer range, directly targeting Ben Gurion International Airport, not just a transportation hub, the physical symbol of Israel's connection to the world, the gateway through which commerce flows. Families travel and the diaspora comes home. All intercepted, confirmed the IDF, but the message was clear and deliberate. Nowhere in Israel was beyond reach. Not its most iconic infrastructure, not its lifeline to the outside world. Iran separately targeted Palmachim Air Base on the Mediterranean coast. Associated with Israel's space and advanced missile programs, it targeted Ovda Air Base in the Negev. Iran's army announced drone strikes aimed at the Meron radar installation in northern Israel, a critical early warning and air defense node. These were not random acts. They were systematic efforts to blind and disable Israel's ability to see what is coming and respond to it, while keeping the entire civilian population in a state of sustained, unrelenting terror, as if managing a sustained Iranian ballistic missile campaign were not already stretching Israel's defensive systems to their limits. The country suddenly found itself fighting on 2 fronts at once, and the timing of it was not accidental. On March 2nd, Hezbollah fired its first missiles and drones at northern Israel since November 2024, reopening a front that for a cautious few months had seemed to be gradually quieting. Hezbollah, the Lebanese militant organization that Iran has armed, funded, trained, and directed for 4 decades, re-entered the conflict at precisely the moment it could cause maximum disruption to Israel's already strained defensive posture. Defense analysts quickly identified what they called a pincer effect. Iran was launching ballistic missiles from the east, crossing hundreds of kilometers of Iraqi and Syrian airspace before appearing on Israel's radar horizon with 7 minutes of warning. Hezbollah was firing rockets, anti-tank missiles and drones from the north at ranges of just a few kilometers across the Lebanese border, with virtually no warning time at all. Two completely different threat directions, two completely different flight profiles, two completely different interception systems required simultaneously. And the timing was clearly deliberate. Military analysts noted that Hezbollah appeared to be monitoring the flight time of Iranian ballistic missiles, roughly 7 minutes from launch to impact, and coordinating its own salvos to arrive over northern Israel at the same moment that central Israel systems were already engaged with Iranian threats, splitting the attention and resources of Israeli Air Defense Command at exactly the worst possible time, forcing operators to make triage decisions about which threats to prioritize with limited interceptors available. By March 12th, Hezbollah had launched 325 separate attack waves against Israel since re-entering the conflict. In a single night around that period, approximately 220 munitions were fired from Lebanese territory toward Israel. 66% were aimed at IDF positions in southern Lebanon. The rest targeted civilian and military sites in northern and central Israel, including residential buildings in Arab towns in the Galilee region. On March 14th, the most recent Saturday, Hezbollah fired cluster munitions from Lebanese territory into the northern Israeli border town of Metula. Cluster munitions from the north. On the exact same day, Iran launched at least 6 separate missile volleys from the east. Sirens sounded across the country in multiple waves throughout the day. 2 impact sites were confirmed in central Israel. A 12-year-old boy in Eilat in the south was moderately injured by glass shards from a nearby blast. A 39-year-old man in the same city was lightly wounded. In Shaham in central Israel, a cluster bomb submunition landed on the roof of a residential building and ignited a fire. Emergency crews arrived. The fire was extinguished. The scene was photographed and shared online, and a few hours later, the sirens started again. When you spend enough time with the statistics of a war, numbers start to lose their weight. 3,000 wounded starts to feel like a data point rather than 3,000. Individual human beings whose lives have been altered permanently. So it is worth taking a moment to resist that effect, to get close enough to what these numbers represent that they feel real again. By March 12th, the 12th day of the war, at least 14 Israeli civilians had been confirmed killed, and 2,745 people had been injured. In the 24 hours of March 12th alone, one single day, 179 civilians were injured from Iranian missile fire. Not over a week, not across a month. 179 people hurt in one day. More than 3,000 Israeli residents have been forced to leave their homes entirely. Not because they chose to, because the buildings they lived in were struck directly by missiles or damaged beyond safe. Habitation by debris from intercepted rockets falling out of the sky. Schools across the country have been closed. The Education Ministry confirmed that schools in the Tel Aviv area and across the northern region will not reopen in the foreseeable future. Hundreds of thousands of children are now entering their 3rd consecutive week of remote learning, many of them still too young to fully understand why they are not allowed to return to their classrooms, why the adults in their lives keep going tense and quiet when the phones go off, why the routine of their lives has been replaced with shelters and silence and waiting. The psychological dimensions of 16 consecutive days of missile attacks cannot be captured in a casualty count. In Tel Aviv, a local resident was arrested after allegedly refusing to allow other civilians into a bomb shelter during a siren and physically assaulting a woman trying to get inside. 16 days of sustained terror does not only manifest in physical injuries, it fractures something in the social fabric of a community. It corrodes the instinct to protect and shelter each other that societies depend on in crisis. The Israeli Health Ministry issued guidance specifically telling people to run to shelters with caution because a significant portion of the war's injuries have come not from missiles but from Israelis falling, colliding with others, or injuring themselves in the panicked scramble for cover when sirens go off at 3 in the morning with no warning. The siren is the danger as much as the missile. The running is the danger. The fear itself is injuring people. 96 confirmed impact sites across the country. 16 consecutive days. Over 3,000 wounded, as of the latest count. Thousands displaced. Hundreds of thousands of children out of school. An economy running at a fraction of its normal capacity. And through all of it, Iran has not paused, not offered a ceasefire, not communicated any willingness to de-escalate. It has simply kept firing. There is something that the people watching this conflict from a safe distance may have noticed and misread. The volume of Iranian missile attacks has come down significantly from the opening days of the war. In the first salvos, Iran was firing 90 missiles in a single barrage. In the current phase of the conflict, that number has stabilized at somewhere between 5 and 10 attack waves per day, still relentless and still terrifying, but dramatically reduced from the initial peak. Some observers have taken this as a hopeful sign, a suggestion that the US and Israeli strikes are degrading Iran's military capacity. That attrition is working both ways, that the end of this chapter may be approaching. Defense analysts are nearly unanimous in a different interpretation. The reduction in volume is not weakness, it is rationing. Iran is deliberately conserving its remaining missile stockpile for a war it intends to fight for months, not weeks. The IRGC's strategy, as it has been articulated explicitly by Iran's own military leadership, not as an analyst's interpretation, but as a stated objective, is a war of attrition. The goal is not to destroy Israel in a single overwhelming strike. Iran's military knows it cannot do that, and it has never claimed it can. The goal is something far more patient and more calculated. Keep Israel under permanent pressure, drain its interceptor reserves to the point where gaps begin to appear in the defense, paralyze the economic life of its major cities, exhaust its population over time, force Israeli and American decision-makers to weigh the indefinite continuation of this cost against the alternative. A political resolution on terms acceptable to Tehran. Iran's foreign minister publicly rejected any ceasefire or renewed talks with the Trump administration. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian, in a video address on March 8th, made the strategic posture plain. He said that the greater the pressure imposed on Iran, the stronger its response would be, and he explicitly vowed to escalate attacks on American targets across the Middle East. These are not the words of a government that is exhausted or looking for an exit. These are the words of a government that has decided it is in this for the long haul and wants its adversaries to know it. The numbers from the air campaign confirm the strategy. The Tel Aviv metropolitan area has absorbed 40% of all Iranian attack waves, 83. Separate volleys aimed at the most densely populated and economically critical urban center in the country. The northern region has absorbed 47 separate waves, the south 44, Jerusalem 32. The average daily rate since day 4 of the conflict stands at approximately 10 attack waves against Israel every single day, combined with Hezbollah's 325 assault waves from the north since March 2nd. The cumulative weight of this sustained campaign constitutes a form of collective trauma and societal strain that no community can absorb indefinitely without lasting damage. The IRGC controls the missiles. The IRGC has made its decision. The war continues. As of March 15, 2026, day 16 of this conflict, here is the full picture. 15 Israeli civilians confirmed killed. More than 3,138 people wounded. Thousands of residents displaced from damaged or destroyed homes. Hundreds of thousands of children unable to attend school for over 2 weeks. The economy of central Israel operating at a fraction of its normal capacity. More than 26 documented Iranian attack waves, 325 additional waves from Hezbollah, a rate of approximately 10 attacks per day against Israeli population centers that has not paused since the first missile launched on February 28th. The weapons Iran is using are banned by more than 100 nations. They are banned not because of a technicality, not because of geopolitical positioning, but because every nation that has studied them has concluded the same thing. These weapons are incapable of discrimination. They cannot distinguish between a military target and a residential neighborhood, between a soldier and a 7-year-old, between a weapons factory and a children's playground. The bomblets they scatter persist in communities long after a conflict ends, waiting to detonate when a child discovers them while playing. The targets Iran has chosen are not military installations. They are a synagogue on a Sunday morning in Beit Shemesh, a playground in Rishon LeZion, a car wash in northern Tel Aviv, a construction site, where two men were trying to finish a shift. Apartment buildings, residential streets, the ordinary geography of civilian life in a modern city. The strategy Iran is pursuing is not ambiguous, and it is not hidden. It has been stated openly by Iranian officials. It is a war of attrition designed to impose an unsustainable cost on Israel and its American partner until one of them folds. And right now there is no ceasefire on the horizon, no negotiations underway, and no sign that Iran intends to stop. There is a family somewhere in the Tel Aviv area right now checking the news before bed, wondering if tonight will be another night of interrupted sleep and shelter sprints. There is a bomb disposal officer somewhere in central Israel marking the location of an undetonated bomblet, lying on the ground in a residential area, placing warning tape around it, making sure no one steps on it before it can be safely removed. There is a teacher somewhere preparing another remote lesson for students who have now missed 3 weeks of school and do not know when they will go back. This is not history. It is not a story that has been resolved or that is winding down. It is happening right now in real time to 9 million people living in a country the size of New Jersey, while the rest of the world processes it through news tickers and social media feeds and decides how much attention it warrants. The weapons being used are illegal. The targets being hit are civilian. The strategy being executed is explicit and unapologetic. The campaign is ongoing. And the question that sits underneath all of it, the question that does not go away when you close the news app or scroll past the headline, is whether the world is actually seeing this clearly, enough to say something true about what it is. Because at a certain point, watching carefully and saying nothing becomes its own kind of statement.